Hello, everyone. So today we have Benjamin Boyce with us. Benjamin is a writer, poet. He was present at Evergreen when things went crazy there in 2017, and he's documented it very thoroughly. He's probably the foremost kind of expert on what happened at Evergreen. He's got a wonderful documentary series up on his YouTube channel. I recommend everyone watch it. And you also do a lot of interviews and looking deeply into the trans issue as well. I didn't check out as much as that content, but Ethan and I are interested to talk to you about that a little bit. Um, so yeah.
Hey.
Welcome, Benjamin.
Welcome. Well, thank you for having me. How are you guys doing this morning?
Pretty good.
Yeah. Pretty good. I have 2 cats, and they've been going crazy all day, running around, fighting each other, knocking stuff over. You might hear them in the back. You might hear a big crash in the background. They probably broke something.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to the Michael Bay feline shenanigans.
Okay, so how are things? You're up near Olympia still, right?
Yeah, I'm in Olympia, which is sandwiched between 2 of the most stellar First World War zones of the modern era, I would say.
How are things in Olympia itself since Saturday?
You know what? I haven't been keeping on top of what's been going on. But, there's just some light terrorism, like, smashing windows for not having the proper signage there. It's kind of a...
Right. Same thing's happening here in Sacramento. And we've already doubled the amount of murders since last year. So, things are going all right.
Yeah. Which lives matter?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in New York City, and there was a point during the first Corona shutdown where crime was way down because people weren't going anywhere. So a lot of crime, people going on the subway, going place to place, going back from work, being out at bars, etc., drinking, that was down. Crime was way down. And since George Floyd incident, crime has been way up. A lot of young people, ironically young people of color, have died in shootings. And I honestly haven't been following it too closely, but there have been the odd Molotov cocktail tossed at a police car, just sort of random chaos. It's funny now because the bridges are getting taken over so much that it's not even really registering. Like a bunch of protesters will all go on the Brooklyn Bridge and shut it down for an hour, or Williamsburg Bridge. And it's happened so frequently that it doesn't even register as surprising. It's like, oh, they shut the bridge down. If that happened February and before, it would have been a huge, major deal.
Yeah. There's a confluence of events going on, and I think that the media is doing a stellar job at selectively reporting incidents in order to fill out what they want to be seen, and they're very obviously shaping public opinion right now. It's pretty just way out in the open. If you look one step below what they're reporting, it's a completely different landscape. So interesting.
Yeah, it's really, if you Google Antifa protests July 25th, and you look at the Google newsfeed, barely anything shows up. Or if stories do show up covering any sort of protest that happened this past Saturday, they always throw Antifa in there in between some far-right extreme groups. And they it's very, very odd.
Yeah. And the... Have you guys seen the video? I think I sent this to you, Raj. There's a big Black Lives Matter street mural in front of Trump Tower, and there was a black woman who took a bunch of paint and started smearing all over it. And just the tone of the reporting and talking about that versus all the other vandalism events, which were a lot of right-wing people, it was hilariously different. And the way she was treated too, the cops didn't want to touch or arrest her. Before, when people went over to mess with it, cops immediately take them away. They did not want to deal with her. It seemed pretty clear that the media just didn't know how to talk about it. So they're like, let's just kind of, shove this down a little. There's no way to spin it, really.
That's very similar to how the media framed or didn't frame Evergreen. lack of media was very stunning. And then who would report on it and what they would say about it was also very telling. And it really seems on a number of different levels of analysis that Evergreen was kind of a dry run of what's going on now in certain respects.
Right. That's the miniature play version of what's going on nationwide now.
Yeah.
Well, so we had at Raj and I both went to Bard from was it 2013 to 17?
Yeah.
And what year was, I think it was 2015 or 2016 when they had this sort of like racial justice rally walkout. But what was really, really funny about the walkout, there's like a campus-wide walkout, everyone occupied a lawn, and Bard's in the middle of the woods. So it's just the middle of the woods, everyone, all the campus talking to each other. But they asked for permission from the administrators so they wouldn't get points taken off their grades. They explicitly had permission. And so it wasn't really a walkout. It was like a sanctioned campus event. And there wasn't really much, there wasn't anyone to butt heads with. So there was no one who openly was disagreeing with this. It was just sort of like, I don't know, almost like a propaganda event. Like everyone's on the same page, like a real rally. And that was just kind of interesting that they asked for permission from the administration and they actually allowed it, encouraged it. They were there. They were, sitting down, listening, etc.
Yeah.
So what was Evergreen like before everything exploded? Because there's a couple of pre-protest practice runs that you document in your documentary series, but I'm more interested in the general climate of how students were interacting with each other, what campus life was like, and all of that.
Well, I would have to preface that by saying that I was a non-traditional student, and I started there when I was 36 in 2013. So I had a different angle on campus life, so-called, than would a 19, 20, 21-year-old, either living on campus or just plugging into the community in that way. But the Evergreen State College has always been known as kind of the oddball college in Washington State. It has a very unique structure. It has a very progressive mindset. In 2011, they officially made social justice like a part of their mission statement. And so it always been on the forefront of kind of progressive leaning, hippy dippy-ish, like a lot of jokes about marijuana and that whole kind of, culture there. And over the course of the years, as progressivism has changed from kind of changed its sights from being inclusive and celebratory of various different cultures to being kind of a monoculture of calling out and policing and all this kind of stuff about being against oppression rather than kind of superseding oppression with a completely different modality of common humanity. That kind of framework shift really was at the forefront of how Evergreen, being so progressively progressive, kind of slowly changed its way of dealing with these issues that it found to be so important to deal with, namely racism, but all these different other kinds of issues under the banner of anti-oppression writ large. And so if you look at the rhetoric around how it tackled these issues with regards to the orientations and the seminars and the workshops that the staff and the faculty would put the students through, you can kind of see where identity kind of became the be-all, end-all of how you interacted with everybody. And, there were sacred identities and profane identities. And by sacred identities, there would be an array of different identities that were put upon a pedestal. And then one specific identity and then adjacent identities that were kind of derided very openly. And so, for instance, constantly a stream of invective, jocular, jokingly, but still a constant stream of invective against the white male and the heterosexual white male, and the cis heterosexual white male would constantly be the butt end of jokes. And if you were one of those, you're kind of expected to take a back seat, hold yourself back, and uplift everybody else. Like it was your turn to be somebody who served these other classes. It was really, literally
So this
your
is,
turn.
sorry to cut you off. This is something I noticed right away when I went to Bard. So I went to a public high school that was fairly diverse, and there's kind of someone making fun of someone for being a white male wasn't unheard of. But then what I saw at Bard was a sort of hyper concentration on making fun of this one identity for a political purpose of, like you said, uplifting other identities. So it went from kind of like, hey, I'm going to make a joke because, there's a joke to be made, versus like we're constantly need to make this one sort of joke to make a political point. And what I noticed was a kind of rise of a new hierarchy on campus. So it went from what they said the old hierarchy was this old, cis, white, straight male, which I think ironically it was once WASPs, right? White, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. Then it just became white cis males, all of them lumped into one group, or people who look like them. And they kind of tried to invert this and create a new hierarchy. And so the Black, trans, woman, disabled, etc., would be at the top. And now we see this openly, just in the news all the time.
Yeah, wasn't there a Black Trans Lives Matter rally in New York, I think a few weeks ago, and it was like very well attended too.
Yeah, and this is what I think is really funny is that people enjoy these things. So the Black Trans rally, like for Black Trans Lives or however they phrased it, was outside the Brooklyn Museum, and this was like a big event. Like everyone had it on their Instagram stories. It was like the Met Gala for like the professional upper, like the yuppie class in Brooklyn. And if you were there, you were there. People are posting online like, see you there, like if you're not there, you're oppressors, etc. But it was, and it's also like we're in quarantine, but the only thing you can do happens to be what liberals enjoy doing, which is holding this sort of dramatic rally. And they were just like broadcasting names with projectors onto the walls. So it was like a pretty like spiffy thing they had going. It was like very, very well done.
Yeah, this inversion of this sort of racial hierarchy, it really stuck out to me in, I think it's episode 2 or 3 of the documentary, when the students are in that closed meeting with George Bridges. And there's one character who's kind of at the forefront of a lot of this incident. I believe his name is Jamil. He begins speaking in this way where he kind of is like pontificating like a high priest, and like it's a very odd thing where he's like, you can kind of see it too in the way that particularly some of the I guess white women are close to him during some of the protests. It's almost as if he's like dispensing some sort of salvation to them through through proximity to him. It's a very, very odd thing. And it's really concerning because people are putting someone on a pedestal not for anything that they've done or achieved or thought, but just because of their identity. And there's another woman, I think she might have been a faculty member, where she says that she's a black body before, and she says her name, she's a black body before she's a professor. And it's like, whoa, you're just saying that race is like more important than the identity of who you are as a person. You said that being a black body is more important than your name. And it's just it's really concerning. I was wondering what mental health was like on campus, how mental health was talked about, how mental health was treated by the administration.
There's a totemic significance to identity if you raise it to that integer of importance. If the black body, if the white body, if all these bodies have so much significance, there's a problem with that because it's incredibly shallow and ergo incredibly boring. There's not a lot of interesting things to do with these immutable characteristics. So the entire frame of reference has to go down into this really, really rudimentary form where there's just a lot of binary thinking. There's a lot of very just shallow kind of calls to define human relationships according to these terms. And because the terms are so shallow and kind of very, very basic, they concentrate energy, right? There's not a lot of things to do in there. So you have to be very it just has to be very strong, and you have to like kind of go down into this kind of pre-modern form of human social organization. And that fuels a lot of the energy that happens in the protest footage, where they have these struggle sessions and they have these kind of ritualistic kind of sessions about how they're performing all of these activities. I think that one way in which to understand that as just kind of this human ritual behavior is to see that the tools that they were given to act out as a community were so flowing rudimentary that they had to kind of just like go down to a pre-level of consciousness, or kind of like a, you know, like a 4 or 5 year old level of consciousness, where we're, you know, kind of one thing that
Tribal mentality.
yeah, tribal. What's that William Golding book?
Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies. People really kind of, it calls to Lord of the Flies because there's a real
Piggy.
childishness to the way that they're performing everything like that.
This is
So
So
that
there's
really-
something very childish about all of it. They're throwing a temper tantrum.
Oh yeah.
This is something Hannah Arendt mentions briefly. I want to see if I pull it up quickly to get an exact quote, because I have the
And she
ebook here.
has
But
a direct tie to Bard, right? Bard is the one that
Yeah.
has an institute. Okay, so
Yeah.
one of my
There's
professors
a-
actually teaches at Bard, and I'm now transcribing a struggle session that he kind of laid the groundwork for and pushed us to go through, based on race.
which professor is this?
David Wolach, Wolach. He's a temporary professor at both Evergreen and Bard.
Okay.
Okay.
So she uses
Yeah,
the phrase enlarged tribal consciousness, which is supposed to unite all people of similar folk origin, independent of history, and no matter where they happen to live. This was a function of what you call continental imperialism. So Europe's imperialism has an effect on the continent. And part of it is that people unite, and it had to do with language groups. So they had these pan-German movements. People who spoke German were supposed to be an identity. They were an identity group, and they were supposed to band together as an identity. And it created this tribal consciousness, where if some person who speaks German is hurt somewhere far away in another country in Europe, you're supposed to feel as if your brother next to you has been hurt, because you're all part of the same tribe. And it creates this, you have people who, like Raja saying, are almost mystics and sages. And it seems like on these, especially like more liberal progressive college campuses that are also kind of set away from the rest of society, they're in a bubble, you get this kind of tribal mentality very quickly. But what I'm curious about is how you think it spread from the campuses to regular life. Because when I was at Bard, people would tell me, oh yeah, it's obviously silly, right? It's obviously crazy. But it's just what happens at college. This isn't, you know, they're going to grow up, they're going to get jobs, and they're going to forget about all this silliness.
Yeah. Well, I think that college is upstream the media. College is upstream HR departments. College is upstream various different locales of power. And, you know, there's this Yuri Benzanov. There's this conspiracy theory where this Russian dude, this Russian asset, or this ex-Russian agent, he's on this TV show, and he talks about how Russia is taking this kind of generational tact to defeat America. And what they're going to do is put these ideas into the institutions of the education, and then step by step, they'll just kind of go through and kind of destroy the fabric of American life, because college is upstream all these other institutions. So there is this, somebody said that in regards to that observation that, oh, this is just something that they're going to go through in college, and then they're going to go out into the real world and they can't act that way anymore. But there's so many people like them in the real world, so-called, that they kind of just do act like that. And I think that we have a confluence of social media giving loud voices a very strong platform, and those loud voices are not necessarily balanced between the radical left and the radical right. The radical right is constantly overblown by the media and shut down. Anything that trends towards the right is shut down. And there's plenty of evidence that Facebook, that Twitter, that YouTube, that Apple, that all these major platforms, they overblow anything extreme right, and then they kind of over suppress anything extreme right, where they kind of allow the extreme left to do its thing and they diminish it as much as possible. So there's an
Right.
asymmetric way in which these extremists are being treated, because the extremists on the left kind of do have institutional power, which is
Did
funny.
you
They're
see
trying to fight the man, but they're very much part of the man right now.
what I noticed at Bard was that a lot of the leaders of, so we didn't have like a radical campus takeover like you had, but there were always constantly these understream like events, rallies, various things that had the same kind of tone, and the same people were saying, or similar people were saying similar things. What I noticed is that the leaders were oftentimes powerful and privileged, not in the sense of maybe their identity politics game, but they had money, their parents were wealthy, they came from, for example, I found out one person's family was very wealthy, construction business, and they're actually related to John Lewis, so they had a bunch of institutional power through that whole thing. But then looking at the Portland protests, one of the leaders of the protests is an ex-NFL running back, and the other leader is a master's degree student is trying to get a PhD, etc. So I noticed that it seemed like these are actually very privileged, powerful people who are leading this, and that's what kind of scared me. It made me worried it was going to make that jump to normal life, normal conversations. So these aren't like the poor kid who has to go work as a law clerk when he graduates. This is someone who's going to be the Google social media manager, or move to San Francisco and do this. Did you notice the same thing at Evergreen?
Specifically in one incident or instance, I'm transcribing like I said, I'm transcribing the struggle session that my last program we had after the week of protests on Saturday. After the week of protests, my teacher wanted to know what was going on, and wanted to hear the Black experience. And we were told as white people that our white silence is violence. Our white silence is literally killing everybody constantly. All quarter, we're just killing everybody constantly. And then when we're like, well, what do you want us to? Shut the fuck up? They told us. Like, well, okay, so you want us to speak, but you want us to shut the fuck up. And then they're like, why is this all about you? Like, this is not about you. Like, well, why are you saying that it's about us if it's not about us? It's not about your white feelings. And then one white female student takes the bait, and she takes the bait. She's like, well, what are you really doing? And then they all jump on her and tear her apart, and she starts crying, and then they start laughing about this white girl and her white feelings, and then
White fragility.
yeah, total white fragility. And the professor is going along with it and like, it's not about us, it's not about us. And then he's talking about how it's all about him, and like the white supremacists are on campus and it's all about him. And it's really insane. It's really insane. And I was there,
That's
and
the
I'm
thing.
like,
That's the thing that strikes me about Evergreen. It seems that the professors were way more bought into it than there's maybe like a handful of professors at Bard who are bought into it, but there's plenty of other professors who are busy doing their own research and whatever they're studying. And particularly, there's one professor that both Ethan and I had, who he would describe himself as a radical Marxist feminist in some instances. But he had an instance in his FISM class, which is a great books program, where a student came to him during office hours, and she broke down in tears, a white girl, because she was like, oh my God, am I really this racist? Am I really like I didn't realize I was this much of a racist, this much of a horrible person. And she's crying, and the professor, he was dumbfounded. He talked to Ethan and I one day while we were walking on campus, and he's like, guys, what's happening? This is a very radical political, like he has very radical political beliefs, but he noticed that this is not okay, that people are accosting students and making them feel terrible about themselves. And that was one of the most stunning things about Evergreen. Is just sometimes it seemed like the professors were like getting off of this whole game. It was very disturbing.
Maybe I think a lot of times too, I saw kids who it seemed like for most of their lives in school, they were kind of the weird kid, the odd kid. They might have had like artsy parents, or they played tuba, or they were, a sculptor, or were into photography. And when you got to Bard, all those things that were lame in high school were cool. So being into photography, being into, I don't know, all sorts of different, you know what I mean? Like sort of more hipster things, you could say. And so when they got to Bard, they were all of a sudden in a position of power. And so then they started bullying people with less power than them. And I think in some instances, professors might have had lives like this too, where they didn't actually have real jobs. They went from being nerds in school. It's nothing wrong with being a nerd, but if you're a nerd, especially 30, 40 years ago, you probably got bullied a little bit. Then they went to college, graduate school, have a stipend, a grant, whatever, and then they become a professor. And so they don't even understand, I think, that they're being bullied sometimes. And I saw certain cases where grown adults were acting like high school bullies, and it's pretty, I don't know, it's pretty shameful, honestly. But I think it has something to do with that, like, if you grow up being bullied all your life and you get a little bit of power, you might turn around and start bullying people who then don't have power.
This ideology that we're dealing with, it has so many tools in it to enable and blind you to bullying, to enable bullying and to blind you to it. It comes pre-justified with bully tactics because it's against bullying, right? It's anti-bullying. It's anti-racist, it's anti-oppression, it's anti-bias. And therefore, all of its biases, racism, oppression, and bullying, it can't see. It's completely blind to that. And anybody who goes along with it needs to forward its agenda. And so when we talk about mental health, look at the mental health of the people who are involved in this, whether they are the perpetrators of it or the adherents, the allies of it. Everybody's got horrible mental health. They're constantly anxious all the time. And they're perpetuating violence and then unable to understand that that's what they're doing. And so they just get into more and more angry, angsty, and then self-justifying cognitive dissonance about the state that they're affecting on each other.
It's classic abuser behavior, quite honestly. You see it in domestic violence type situations where, like, domestic people who perpetrate domestic violence will often heap on how it's the other person, it's the victim's fault that it is. They suffer a lot of guilt, they have a lot of anxiety, and with these kids, what the people in this ideology are doing is they're acting as abusers, and they're not recognizing their role in that. And there is some evidence that when, like, the Nazis, right? They had a victim. They understood themselves to be victims of a raw deal from World War One. And this sort of, if you're taking up the position of a victim and then going and imposing violence or imposing your will on people, but you still see yourself as a victim and powerless, that's very, that leads to Antifa.
Yeah. And this feeds into the media's narrative about Trump being this fascist. And that works directly into the Evergreen State College story. What fomented and supported the students' horrific behavior across the entire year was that Trump got elected in November. And that sent terror through the campus because everybody had accepted this fact that Trump is a fascist, that as soon as he gets in, he's going to set up these gulags or these military, functions to go through and round up everybody who's not a straight white male. And so they always had him as that signifier. And not to say that Trump hasn't played into that. Trump has played into bigotry, but I don't see him as being that big of a bigot so much as using any and all means to destabilize the conversation in order to gain power. I mean, he's a brilliant political operator, but so he's fed into that, but it's not actually the case that that's what he's done. So to have that bully in a position of power has justified so much bullying. And
they just started copying his tactics too. Like when I saw people, when Trump got elected and they're mad at Trump for being a bully, they just became bullies themselves and started going around and acting like Trump, cursing at each other. Every conversation is just like this low level, like, how would you describe it? Like baseless pandering level, like they literally just became imitations of Trump and how they behaved and how they used power.
Well, I do think that part of these woke kids, we see very easily the left's role in creating this thing, because it is a leftist ideology. But these kids were socialized and raised in post 9/11 America. The
Yeah.
Republicans were in power. And there's something about what they're talking about which reminds me of
Yeah.
George Bush a lot.
Yeah.
This emphasis on safety, and also this
And plus that
not
you're either
me,
with
you're
us or you're against us.
me. Exactly. Yeah, that same. And so like these kids grew up in this time period when that was on everyone's consciousness, and kids were inculcated with fear, right? Like the whole thing about terrorism and like the terrorist, what do you call them? That little color coded thing we used to have. I think they brought it back with coronavirus, but they just set it permanently at orange for a while. Um, and
And orange is
yeah,
the bad color, as we know now.
Yeah.
orange man bad.
Orange alert bad.
Oh man. But there is this emphasis on safety that came through with the Bush administration and things like the upgrading of the TSA. I think it does have a role to play in how these kids conceive of their safety. There's one girl, she was screaming, "We don't feel safe. Why aren't you like concerned about that?" And it's like, I'm sorry, I don't really care if you feel safe or not. Like at a certain level, especially when you're becoming adults, you got to learn how to take care of yourself to a certain degree. But that's digression.
Well, that does bring up a really good point, which is that the administrators of the Evergreen State College and the administrators of college in general have seen, and there's several very fascinating reasons why this is the case, but they have seen that it's necessary for them to provide college as a service. And college as a service is not about actually learning. Education is not the function of the administration and the student resources departments.
Overturning power hierarchies.
Experience is is what they are providing. And they're trying to get students to spend their money at these colleges. So they heap up this whole life experience. So it's basically a cruise liner with a degree attached to it, basically. And that's how the administration actually operates. And so the emphasis on safety, the emphasis on anti-bias, and the emphasis on making sure that conflict is resolved and that everybody is understanding not to say these words, and then getting into this more and more authoritarian lockdown on how you can behave and the proper way of behaving in order not to upset people, while having a huge blind spot in the fact that certain people can be the most terroristic, terrible people on the planet, and they're justified and fine by the administration. So that is one current that facilitates the outrageousness on colleges that I think might be replicated with regards to HR departments in the corporate world, as long as the terroristic behavior is operating within the bounds of anti-bias training. It's going to be okay. And that's why it's going to give rise to, as I've been saying, narcissistic sociopaths will win in this ideology, will win in this cultural matrix of morality every time.
So with this mental health issue and this idea of like the return to in loco parentis on college campuses, and I think in addition to that, which I think you described really well, especially being like a cruise liner, I think in the classroom itself, there's this critical pedagogy, Paulo Freire type mentality that the classroom is about overturning power dynamics and hierarchies. It's not about it's not about an educator teaching students. Everyone in the classroom has something equal to offer, and it's more about creating sort of like a hippie drum circle where you all share your experiences. And so that, but you're not there, and in most senses, to get any sort of education. The people who get the most education are probably people who are in like orchestra classes or something like that. But outside of that, it's basically like this anti-bias training. But I wonder how this ties into the high degree of mental illnesses among young people. And I think especially certain young liberal progressive people and also trans people. This is a big issue that's talked about all the time. There's evidence brought up all the time that trans people, trans individuals suffer from extremely high rates of depression, anxiety, suicide, various mental health problems. I wonder and there's also, you bring up this narcissism thing. A lot of what's talked about in terms of fixing these mental health problems has to do with representation and sort of like these Instagram campaigns. And I think it does sort of encourage, if people have a photo shoot and I get a lot of likes on Instagram, that's going to solve their anxiety issues. and then that's going to fix things. Do you see any of this being sort of connected?
In episode 20 of the Complete Evergreen Story, my documentary, it focuses basically on two individuals. One is, as you mentioned, Jamil, who is a flamboyant gay man who calls himself a femme, which is not trans. I don't know. And he's basically incredibly talented orator and leader, very charismatic, very stunningly attractive too. He's like this kind of Grecian god, but like an African Grecian kind of like this statue. And I've seen him in person. He's got a lot of magnetism, but underneath that is this rolling insecurity and this hole of needing to be fulfilled and recognized. And at the end of that episode, there's this extended video that I found of him laying on his bed, and he's calling out his audience. He's shaming his audience for liking his political posts, but never liking enough his selfies. And he goes into how men hate that misogyny and trans noir misogyny, or misogyny against black female males. If you can get your head around that, it comes down to the selfie and how men don't like selfies. So he's really pining for a father figure. He's really pining for, like, there's this matrix of story of this family drama that's being acted out, where the students are looking for an authority figure while at the same time understanding their role is to tear down authority. And when you see this contradiction wide open with them attacking George Bridges constantly and wanting the police called off. And so George Bridges, he basically emasculates himself on a number of different levels. Mm-hmm. He takes out his teeth, he takes out his balls, he takes out his ability to move his hands, he takes out every single aspect of authority to appease them, right? And they still don't feel safe. They want him to do something right now to make them feel safe. And they don't want any methods of authority. They don't want any cops. They don't want any actual something that will protect them, but they still want protection at the same time. They want a father figure, but they've been programmed by their culture or by the school to hate authority. So it's this contradiction. And that's what's playing out in Portland, and it's playing out in Seattle, where we have very weak leadership. And because the leadership's so weak, it's not fulfilling the desire of the mob to destroy authority, because there's no authority there. So they provoke the federal authority, and and that's why they're concentrating around the federal buildings, and that's why they're concentrating on Trump. They want somebody to tear down, and their leadership is too weak.
It also would lead to, I think that leads to a sort of identity crisis too, that might manifest as a mental illness. So like, I don't know if people are necessarily aware of it, but let's say there's an imaginary person similar to this Jamil character who's a successful, attractive trans activist, and they have money, they have influence, they have power. At a certain point, they're going to run out of things to push against, because they've gotten everywhere. They're the ambassador at GLAAD, they're this role model, they're a model for Victoria. You know, if you get to a certain level of success, especially at these small college campuses, you're going to run out of things to push against. So you're just going to start tearing down everything. And if you're not constantly engaging in movement and sort of going somewhere, I think that starts to manifest as a mental illness to some degree. And people get this sort of like cognitive dissonance going on. Yeah. But I think there's a deeper issue going on with depression, especially, where, like, I think even before a lot of kids are going to college, they kind of come in they're exposed to the internet, and there's something about internet and social media that's inculcating a depressive mode, and that's exaggerated by colleges. But I'm wondering if you think there's any specific connection between because you deal a lot with trans issues, the trans extremely high rate of mental issues in the trans community. If you think that there's a specific tie or connection or link going on there, or if you think something's causing that.
The trans issue is very complex, and there's a number of different levels to it. So in order for me to talk about one aspect of it, I need to say that I'm not talking about other aspects of it. But we could concentrate on the ways in which trans identity is being used by specifically young women as a catch-all solution. It's weird. It's like every once in a while, females in our society congregate around one problem, and that one problem becomes a solution for all their other problems. Because if they're trans, or if they're anorexic, or if they have ritual child abuse, or Satan come after them, or they have hysteria, if they have that, then all of their other problems will be solved around this one issue. And for whatever reason, and there's a number of different really big questions about this because there's so much money involved, the trans identity is being offered by the medical and the psychological establishment as a way for young women and young men to, like, solve their problem by, modifying their body in different chemical and surgical ways. Now, if you look at, the dramatic uptick in young females specifically identifying as trans, whereas historically it was very rare and was mostly males. It was mostly males. And there's science behind that, or there's some interesting questions about the way in which the male brain is activated and the female brain is activated that kind of shows you why males have more what's called paraphilias, or more very, very specific, very intense sexualities. Has to do
like a foot
probably,
fetish would be a paraphilia, right?
a foot fetish, or transvestitism, or autogynephilia, or homosexuality in males versus females.
Asphyxiation.
Yeah, various different fixations, including and surpassing asphyxiation.
That's not good.
So it's difficult to constellate that question into why is it that young people today have mental illness. And I would want to take the tack that a mental illness is an imbalanced personality that has kind of gotten out of control. And there are certain forms of brain development, or there's certain people who have hard-coded illnesses or imbalanced functionalities in the world. And that would be something for hard psychiatrists to get into. But on the aggregate level of society, I think that there are cultural influencers that are pushing young people to organize themselves around a thoroughly unsatisfactory way of engaging with other people and themselves and their image of themselves. And that comes down to how social media, there's a dramatic increase in depressive behaviors and anxiety behaviors that dovetails with the rise of the smartphone. Having them,
Right.
having yourself constantly compared numerically on a surface level to everybody else, right? Like your photos getting so many likes, somebody else's photos, and not just your peer group, but the best of the best. Like you're competing now with, I guess, Cindy Crawford or whatever. I can't come up with a modern.
Chrissy Teigen.
There's someone, what is it? In the past, if you were poor and you grew up in a poor neighborhood, you didn't realize it. But with social media, you realize how poor you are.
Yeah. And
because
so
you can see what everyone else is doing.
When you get to college, and this period in history, it's why there's so many protests is because the kids have nothing else to do. Like the young people have nothing else to do. They don't have any jobs. They don't have any school. They don't have any prospects. They don't have anything to do. And they need to do things, and they need to do it together. And this activism stuff has been curated over time to give meaning, to give group solidarity, and to give actual justification to, just get your yayos out in a certain way. So we see that meaning making happening to galvanize people into some sort of larger story than themselves.
I want to backtrack a little bit where you talk about not to focus too much on him, but Jamel and the sort of crying out for a father figure. I saw that episode at the end, and it's like, oh man, this kid just really wants someone to love him for him, and not because of anything that he's performing. He wants someone to really care about him. And I don't know how to make sense of this thing, but I was talking to Ethan about it before this conversation, actually. And in the past 400 years, I guess you can say 1619 or whatever, there's been this issue cropping up repeatedly from different segments of our society, whether it be the slave master, whether it be the well-intentioned white liberal, whether it be the academy demonizing the patriarchy. And that is this effort, and this is something Black Republicans talk about a lot, the emphasis on having fathers in the home. There's been this whatever force, impulse that keeps trying to separate Black men from their families and then telling Black women and their children that they're better off without that father or husband. It's a very weird thing. I don't know what to make of it, but it seems to be cropping up over and over again. And now with this sort of assault on this notion of patriarchy, they're trying to get rid of father figures in general. And this is where I do think religion has a role to play in kind of ameliorating this problem. Freud kind of gets poo-pooed on this aspect of his critique of religion as he sees religion in a lot of ways as it being daddy in the sky. And, it's kind of a superficial critique on one level, but I do think that is one of the functions of a God figure. It is this parent-like figure that is going to love you no matter sort of what you do. And that's similar in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, like anything that has sort of a strong deity figure that's outside of reality or outside of the world. It's like you are loved and you have worth in your being itself. Yeah. It's a very this is why the Christians have like a category of Satan. Like it helps with sort of trying to tie this problem into like one specific thing. I mean, I don't know how I feel about all that, but there is something because that is right. That is what Genesis is about. This rebelling against authority on one level, and then asking and but there's this rebelling against authority. And then the Bible, in a lot of ways, is, well, how do we get back into alignment with that authority? Because as much as, especially here in America, we do have a anti-authority bent in our thinking in a lot of ways, like getting rid of the king and all that, which I do think is probably a good thing in the long run. And there is a certain level where you should be questioning authority, but that doesn't mean you can dispense with the category of authority. And that's what we see. These kids are trying to dispense with authority. Meanwhile, they are saying, I want authority to help me. Because you need someone who is outside of the social situation to sort of clamp things down and make sure things don't go haywire.
But I think, too, in a secular sense, you could replace, and not even in secular, but in absent of a family or father figure, you could replace that with a role model. So let's say you don't have a strong father figure, you're not religious. Looking back in history at famous Americans or famous, if you're a musician, famous musicians or famous artists who accomplish things in history, that might give you this sort of relationship you're talking about that one might have with their religion, that they look up to something outside of their immediate self. But I think it does
what you need is a tradition.
Who are your role models? But who can be your role models? Everyone in the past was racist or sexist, and now even figures like Martin Luther King, they're saying, well, if you look at his diaries or etc., you look at these investigations, he was a sexist too. Malcolm X has similar. So if you're, I think, especially if you're a young Black man, or even just a young man who might not have a strong family or like your family, don't get along with them, you don't even have this ability to look towards role models anymore for this sense of authority, because they've all been torn down as these bigots, essentially. Not even bigots.
You can't look at an ideal. There's no ideal for you to move towards. That was I forget what episode it is, but when the students took over the dedication of the Peirce building, and Thomas L. Peirce was going to speak, the previous president, that just made me deeply sad, because that just seems like a guy who there's the role model for you guys. He became college president, and it sounds like he's the one who instituted some of this change towards the shift in social justice thinking. It came back to bite him in the ass, but it was just, that made me so sad. And when the student says it's not about your grandparents, blah, 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 and Peirce took real issue with that, as he should have, because it's like, well, what is this all for then? we're trying to improve the condition of human beings and Americans through time. And it's like as much as these kids are destroying the past, they've destroyed the future too.
Yeah, yeah.
They want everything right now, and
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's unsustainable is the problem, because you're not going to be able to fix everything right now.
Yeah. No, and you can't fix anything by, taking over a highway every night or a bridge every night. There's
Yeah, that
nothing.
too.
That's my
It's
favorite
just a
one.
rave.
That's my favorite one is when I don't remember, I don't want to get the details wrong, but there's some highway they took over. I think it was in Aurora, Colorado. And a car drives through and they start shooting at it. And everyone,
Yeah,
but
that
it's
was
like,
just the
why
other
are you
day.
there in the first place? Why are you there blocking this highway? You literally caused a problem. There would have been no car driving towards any protesters. There's no reason to be there. Going on that highway solves nothing, accomplishes nothing. It's just total performance. And
Yeah.
it's like, what you're telling, go hang out on a highway? That seems like some like right-wing troll is pranking them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
There's
just
this.
asking for trouble.
It goes back to what we were talking about earlier about just the absolute shallowness of what's going on. There's no philosophy. There's no leadership. There's no role model. There's no system other than we are against the bad things that happen. We are against bad things. We're against bad things, like that, basically that's all like it amounts to. And I wonder, like you crunch the numbers, like, okay, how long are they going to do this before they're going to get really tired of this? And what are some of the resources that we can provide them in the wake of all this stuff? Or is this serving some other, influence? And what is it really accomplishing? What are these useful idiots being useful toward?
To capital, I think, to corporations. They're essentially, they've given a bunch of corporations who are very bad, like Nike, that have been caught using the Uyghur labor, slave labor in China, etc. Visa, MasterCard, go up and down the most powerful corporations in the world. They seem to be the one who's benefited from it. And before this whole George Floyd, might be a little conspiratorial, but before the George Floyd incident, most people were kind of getting on board with, hey, universal health care. Hey, we really need to dramatically change the way that capitalism is working in this country. Fast forward 2 months, all everyone can talk about is race. They're so completely obsessed with race, and I think they're being used as useful idiots by the capitalists. Are you familiar with the book The Excellent Sheep by William Deresiewicz?
No.
He's a Yale graduate and Yale professor whose parents went to Yale, I believe, as well. May have been professors. So he's like in this sort of Yale culture very deep. And when he becomes, make long story short, when he becomes an admittance person, when he gets involved with admitting students, he realizes this is all a game. This is all an elaborate game to get the type of students that Yale want, staging this charade to get the right sort of excellent sheep. And he sees the college students, especially at Yale, as being these overachievers who are spiritually empty.
Right. And this book came out about 10 years ago.
So basically his thesis is that the students at Yale and a lot of these top colleges, not necessarily just the Ivy League, but the top colleges are creating a class of excellent sheep. They're very good at performance. They're very well polished. They are very good at speaking. They use big words. They have great vocabularies. They get A's on exams, but there's an absence of meaning in their life. So they're just endlessly striving for something that once they attain doesn't actually provide any meaning in their life. And not only that, but they're encouraged to be sheep. They're encouraged not to think for themselves, but to go along with this sort of campus activist sort of mentality. And so they're not actually revolutionaries or radicals because they're actually being encouraged by the administration themselves. And I think that's sort of shifted into what we see now as like the radical sheep. So at first they were like mostly well-behaved and placided, and they didn't take it too far off the campus. And that's what Deresiewicz started to see when he was kind of shocked by his students' lack of actual, I don't know if talent's the right word, but you have people who by all on paper seem to be the smartest kids in all of America. But when you look into it, it's actually just, their parents are rich. That's why they're at Yale and their resumes look so good. And now fast forward to our colleges has been doing a similar thing, except for maybe kind of looking at identity more. I don't know if they've become more economically diverse. I think now you have a radical sheep group, and that this sort of phenomena has carried forward, but now they've been doing it for so long that it's old hat. So now the next step is to be radical, to try and take this to the streets, to the cities, blah, blah. And combined with this quarantine where people are very bored. And what I've been saying is that they literally created a crisis that necessitates liberals going out in the streets and having fun, what's fun for them, and everyone else has to stay home during a quarantine. So it kind of fits very neatly into like, I don't want to stay home anymore.
Yeah.
I'm curious about if there was any sort of attack on art at Evergreen, because that is something that we saw in not really it wasn't at the forefront of anything related to woke ideology at Bard, but it was definitely there in the background. Like there's this, because some people said like the time for art is over. It said something along those lines, and there's like this almost resentment of creative, talented, artistic people in a way. And I think this is related to the sheep question.
When I first arrived on campus, I decided to take a course called Iconoclasms, which is about the creation and the destruction of images. And I had 3 female professors, one creative writing, one literature, Shakespearean, and then the third an icon carver, or somebody, a professor of woodcuts and, intaglio printing. And, I get on campus and there's this big banner that says, nobody wins under patriarchy. Let's smash it, right? And like it's just like right in your face, like 1992 feminism, the campus. I'm like, okay, this is bullshit. Okay, what are you? I was kind of like weird, kind of put off by it, but like in a joking manner because I'm older. I thought people had gotten beyond that way of conceiving the world, but no, that's a really valid. People live their lives within that smashing the patriarchy rubric, but about 2 or 3 weeks into the classes there, I realized that I had been against the man. I had been like a rebel for like so long. All of a sudden, I'm the man now. And the teachers are all female, and I'm kind of an older guy. And, I look younger than my age, but I'm older. I have a different bearing. And I would get targeted by females with daddy issues. It was just, I don't mean that derogatorily. Like young women would take out their frustrations on the world directed at me, and they would attack me, and like they would just go after me, in this really interesting way, and like be kind of just exhausted because somebody's acting toward you in a way that just has no proportionality to your relationship as fellow students. You're like, okay, well, I contextualize that by like, you're slightly attracted to me, but you don't know how to express that. And plus you have all these anxiety issues about the patriarchy that is being pushed against us constantly. Everybody's privileged, everybody's privileged, everybody's privileged. And we're studying art. We're studying like the most fabulous tradition of art, in my humble opinion. And there's this way of putting yourself into context towards greatness, right? So we're studying greatness, but we don't have the tools to create that ourselves. We only have the tools, I'm speaking about a younger generation, of just kind of like taking photographs. Our cell phones do all of the creativity for us. We just kind of click the button and then they produce this wonderful thing. So we're confronted by, the gates of hell by Rodin, and like the gap of expertise and of actual aesthetic prowess and inspiration and labor and hard work and focus and determination. The gap is so profound that you have these critical tools that come to fill that gap, to say, well, no, these people are privileged. These people are oppressive. These people are colonialists. You don't have to emulate them. All you have to do in your relationship to them, to overstand them, to master the masters, you just undermine them. You just completely undermine them. And my professor explicitly said, later on, 2 years later, when I saw her in this weird religious ceremony, where she's making a "this I believe" statement, and she says that, basically we have to undermine the Western canon. We have to, challenge our assumptions of what is beautiful and what is good, and we have to, assume, basically what we have to do is assume that all these people are privileged, undermine them, because to do anything else is to forward white supremacy. And so that greatness is no longer achieved and no longer achievable. And actually, even trying to achieve greatness is a tool of white supremacy. You're being complicit in oppression to achieve the finest, highest ideal of beauty. So it's not just that there are no ideals. It's that every ideal has to be smashed, because ideals lead to, disparity. Ultimately,
Right.
the difference between me and another student comes down to my ability to focus and to play around with the ideas that I'm tooling with, and to create something that is novel, that is unique, that captures attention and that modulates attention. My pursuit of the beautiful, my pursuit of what I conceive of as an ideal of, literary accomplishment, is antithetical to critical theory and to the critical modality of inverting hierarchies constantly, of uplifting the marginalized. And ultimately, who's the most marginalized? Ultimately, the person who marginalizes themselves by not participating creatively in the world. The people who refuse or are unable to participate creatively in the world are the most marginalized. And in the domain of art, that is the one who's are lifted up. So you have all this political art, all this art that doesn't have any substance other than making a statement comes up. And, whenever I go to a museum, I go to the ancient art, and then I go to the pre-modern art and watch, and I get more and more filled with inspiration. And then there's this magic date somewhere in the last century where I enter into a room and I just get really profoundly anxious, and just I just want to throw up. Like there's something happened where we're no longer pursuing, we're no longer trying to be better. We're just like attacking and performing how much worse everything before us is, or around us is.
I took a gender and sexuality of music class, and one of the things that the professor walked us through was this attacking the notion of genius. Geniuses don't exist, and that geniuses, insofar as they do exist, it's this product of privilege or whatever. And we were talking about modern pop music for the most part, and denigrating Beethoven. And we had to read this article by, I believe the academic's name is Halberstrom. And the article is The Queer Art of Failure. And when I first read it, they're talking about this sort of how success is conceptualized in America. And I was like, oh, I get what this person is saying. They're just a little misguided, because there are some ways in which success is, I think, conceptualized poorly in America. But I actually missed the point of what this person was saying. And that is, no, you should fail. Like, failure is the good thing. Success is bad. And when I first read it, being, I don't know, 19 and being like, yeah, people still want good things. I read it and just thought, oh, this person is not understanding that you can change the definition of success a little bit. You can sort of shift that and make it into a more beautiful, wholesome thing. But that's not what was happening in this article. It was actually an attack on
it's just resentment.
Success itself. Really
that's what you see. It's inherently unsatisfactory to just accept your own failures, or to accept the fact that you aren't going to get that far in life on whatever level metric you want to do. It's unsatisfactory to actually just embrace that, especially if you're 20. Who wants to say, okay, well, failure is just what you have to do. That's the great, awesome thing to do. No, you're going to have to say, I want more than that. So I'm going to go around and tear down everything that is successful. Like, I have to be a successful failure by the fact of completely demolishing anything that's better than me. And that's why I see this operate this dynamic operating with regards to what they call politically equity. Equity is trying to equalize the environment. And so what you do is you say that the white people have it better than the people of color. And ideally, we would lift up the people of color to the same level. But no, we can't actually do that. What we have to do is tear down the white people and then kind of slightly lift up the brown people. Tear down the white people, lift up the brown people. And that's really attractive because tearing something down gives you this odd sense of elevation. It's like, oh, I'm getting high on that building falling down, but you're actually, everything's reduced to rubble. And that's what the Evergreen College, like in sum, that's basically what's operating. At the end of the game of Evergreen, like everybody's diminished. The quality of the education's diminished. The name is diminished. Everybody's embarrassed. Everybody is completely a fool, whether they like it or not. I mean, there's a few survivors, but everybody loses in this situation.
So
Except for the administrators, which get to push a bunch of speech codes into place to control people more. But they
made everyone equal by taking everyone's stuff away, essentially. Like you could, if somebody's on a pedestal, like let's say they see white people as being privileged, instead of trying to get everyone to the point where you're privileged, where you're happy, they're like, it's easier to tear them down. Then everyone's sitting around in a burned down hut, then they're equal finally. But to go back 1 second, there was a speech when, I don't know what, it was one of the first several weeks we were at Bard. It was either the first day or after we had our intro. We had like a couple week course, a reading and writing course. But it was definitely all of the freshmen on campus were all gathered in one location. And one of the deans, who was I think the first year dean or one of the upper level deans, she was like a specific type of administrator. She was warning against this having any sort of hubris or really self-confidence more. So she was like, some people are going to come to a Bard and they're going to think, I'm so smart, I'm so much better than everyone else, I know what's up, I'm going to go to class and kind of be hubristic and full of themselves. And at first I was like, oh, that's kind of a reassuring thing to hear, because I didn't go to the best high school, and I've already heard kids kind of having this snobby, know-it-all, like, oh, I read Nietzsche in freshman year of my private Philip Exeter Academy, whatever, etc. So at first I thought it was a rebuke against this sort of unsubstantiated sort of self-confidence. Like, you think you're so smart just because you went to a fancy private school. But then I realized as she kept talking, and the next couple of weeks, that what they were actually talking about is just the idea of anyone being smarter than anyone in general. So it wasn't, if somebody gets an A on a paper and somebody gets a D, you're just better at different things. There's no such thing as someone being smarter or more capable. And this sort of creates just a race to the middle, or almost sometimes to the bottom, where if you're in college and you spend your whole life probably trying very hard to be smarter than other people, get higher test grades, you suddenly get there, and this idea of success and achievement is just resented and lowered down as the opposite, like inverted as an ideal. All of a sudden,
you don't get rid of the competition, though. The hierarchy, the drive for status is always going to be there. So what you do is eradicate some sort of objective standard, and then just have everybody wrestle over power, wrestle over the lowest common denominator. People are always going to be competitive. You're always going to have winners and losers, and changing the game is just going to produce a different organization of
being openly. Cat's got my tongue. What's the term? Being openly ambitious was seen as bad. So people would kind of be openly the opposite of ambitious, not lazy, but they would be like, oh, I'm not going to try too hard. I didn't read that book. But they actually did read the book. And they actually did try very hard. And they actually did stay up all night writing the essay. And they actually did get an A. And so they actually are competitive in that sense. And they actually are going to go to grad school. And, I'm not saying necessarily aren't competitive, but ostensibly they're projecting this sort of rejection of trying or blah, blah, and that kind of lowers the whole classroom down to a conversation that's just, in my opinion, was just bland, cliches being spouted. And people were still very ambitious and tried very hard, but Raj, you can attest to this. There are students who would talk openly about equity nonstop, and then they wouldn't tell you what date the essay was due for a scholarship or something like that. There was this very cutthroat, mean group of kids, but they would never let you catch them trying. And they tried very hard to look like they didn't try
there's
hard
a
to look
parallel,
good,
there's a parallel with rich kids putting up an image of being not rich. It's not necessarily the same thing, but there's the hipster kind of kid who came from some privileged, wealthy family in New York City who is the one in the raggediest, dirtiest clothes. Um, and there, that same dynamic happened in the um, uh, field of academic competition, where kids would put up the social persona of saying that they're not trying hard or whatever, or that this whole game is stupid, but then they're still going to go on and play into the game in their private life, or if it's just between themselves and a teacher.
If you all do a walkout during the exam, they're going to sneak back in when no one's looking and be the only one who gets the A on the exam.
So Arendt talks about ethics and morality in a very specific way. She rejects kind of the idea of tradition and religions in a lot of ways. I don't necessarily agree with her on that. But when she talks about ethics and morality, one of the things that she does is she goes back to the roots of the words, and ethics and morality, but they both have something to do with customs and repeatable behaviors that have carried through time. And one of the things that I noticed in the whole Evergreen saga is there's a specific way a college operates that's with a like a code of conduct. A meeting is run in a very specific way, and that way happens to work. These kids come in and they have what you call struggle sessions, right? And it's a breakdown of how the meetings are supposed to normally operate. And I want to read a quick Confucian saying. Lack of decorum. Sun Kung wanted to do away with sacrificing of a lamb at the ceremony in which the beginning of each month is reported to ancestors. Confucius said, Tzu, you love the lamb, but I love the ceremony. And it's like he has this student who wants to make it so that we stop the lamb slaughter every month because it's bad to kill a lamb. But Confucius is saying, no, you have to keep doing it in the same way because we know that way works. And Confucius it's not a conservative in the sense of like modern political conservatives, but he is a conservative thinker. And there is something that, like evolution itself is a conservative process. You have to build upon things which work. And these irritable behaviors that have perpetuated through time that actually create change, that actually facilitate dialogue between people. You can't disrupt the form and still expect the content to be there. And that was one of the things that was so strange about but these, like, they have all these lists of demands. It was just very confusing as to where the demands were, who actually knew what the demands were. And it's like, well, that's what happens when you devolve into chaos. When you get rid of the ceremony, so to speak, you're actually not going to be able to have harmony or meaning between people because people are used to doing things in a certain way. And if that breaks down, we don't recognize how reliant we are upon certain rituals in a sense. Even if that ritual comes in the form of, an HR meeting. But I wanted to ask you a little bit, this is, I guess, a little bit off topic, but you just released a video about what you believe. Do you mind if we talk about that a little bit, Benjamin?
Oh, shit.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
Okay. You talk about this relationship with the source and this sort of undefined monotheism that you have found yourself to believe in. You kind of had a deconstruction of your Christian faith that you were raised in.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's a book that came out in the late 60s, maybe early 70s, called Habits of the Heart. And there one of the authors is Robert Bella. It's written by a team of sociologists. And one of the things that they discovered was with the decline of religious communities and like the rise of individualism in America, you get something called Sheilaism. That's the term that they use in the book. There's a woman who talks about her beliefs in kind of a cherry-picked new age way where she will grab things from various traditions, and it's like very much about her relationship with herself, maybe God, however you're going to define that thing. And it's a very individualistic type of religion.
Yeah.
And Bella is very concerned that this kind of belief with something like Sheilaism, what you could have is 330 million different religions in America, a religion for each person. And I am curious, you seem to have found some sort of communion with this divine, but it hasn't prompted you to return to a community in any way. And you have also said that you reject the position of talking about things in a theologically axiomatic driven way. I'm curious as whether you see yourself ever returning to a specific community, or how could you foster community with this belief that you have?
I was in Innsbruck, Austria in 2010, I believe. So probably about exactly 10 years ago, because it was summer, and it was for a World Congress for my the spiritual organization that I belong to, called Subud. And I was walking around Innsbruck, and I saw this old door. Like there was a street, and then there's just this old door. It's like this really, like the wood is really dark, and it was just polished from use. It was really heavy door. Like that thing is like hundreds of years old. Let's see what's behind the door. So I get through the door, and then all of a sudden I'm ushered into a pew, and I'm in this weird little Catholic church that's kind of like scrunched in, because it's an old town. They just kind of like kept on adding and subtracting buildings. So it's just kind of like, you get it through it, and you're just in this other chamber. And I think it was my first Catholic mass, and I didn't even mean to be in there. So like I go in there like, okay, well, I guess I have to go along with the meeting. And you sit down, and then you stand up, and you sit down, and you stand up, and you mumble, and you look around, and you sit down, and you stand up. And I was just like following along. And out of the corner of my eye, this blue, I remember it was this blue light kind of started radiating from the entire room. And I could feel the layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of people coming here to worship. And that entire stack was just polished into this place. And I became a part of that. And my worship resonated with that. And when I got back to America, and then in my spiritual practice, it's called, the organization's called Subud, Subud. And then the content of Subud is this thing that's a Javanese word for spiritual exercise, and it's called the Latihan Kejiwan, and it's just a Javanese word for spiritual exercise. And in this spiritual exercise, which generally lasts about half an hour, men and women are separated into different rooms. We have a quiet period, and then there's a half an hour of this practice, this exercise. This exercise is completely prompted from within. There's nobody telling you what to do. You are quiet, and then you follow your guidance. And everybody does it completely differently. But after attending that Catholic Mass, I went to Latihan later that day, and I started crossing myself. I started, and I felt this. I felt something. I felt the content of that. And I started doing that all the time. And just doing that now, I feel a change in my energy, right? And
Right.
so when I got back to America, I'm like, well, I guess I'm a Catholic or something. So I started going to Catholic Mass, And I go into and I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time, and I go in there and the priest started speaking in English and I just started getting really pissed off. I'm like, shut the fuck up and get out of my fucking way. And I was really, really angry. I'm sorry to use those terms. I was really angry because the English language was activating a part of me that was making me think, and I did not want to be there to think. I did not want to participate in the ritual in a way where I was thinking about it. And so with regards to what a religion is, uh, a a well-constructed spiritual a well-constructed religion with a spiritual content, and it will have different layers for different types of interaction. There's the absolute outer layer of it, which is just the ritual that people go and it's a form for the congregation to sync up with itself. And there's that activity. There's the slaughtering of the lamb. There's the words spoken, and then everybody comes in, goes through that ceremony, and then goes out, and that synchronizes the society according to one framework. And it's completely shallow. It's pretty, it's beautiful, it's pretty, it's sensual, but there's not really a lot of content to it. If you just interact with it, you go to Easter, you go to Christmas, it's your tradition, right? On another level, there is the meaning attached to every symbol. That's where you start to, go through confirmation, you go and you kind of learn the symbolism, you learn the stories, you ask the questions. There's a Talmudic tradition, and in every religion that has survived, there's this other layer where people talk about the religion and go through the theological principles. That is completely valid. I'm not necessarily against that. People get stuck there, and there's two other levels to that. There's a level where you start going into mystical experience, where you start to, in the context of the ritual, in the context of the meaning, you let go of both of those, and you kind of prepare for something that's actually for you from the highest. And that might never happen to you. You might never get to a place where the religion actually has a spiritual content. But that's the hope. The hope is that there is actually a reality that all these things are pointing to that is actually transcendent to all the devices that are used to point to it. So when I speak about religion, I am very wary of getting obsessed with how we're pointing at that. The pointing should always be in preparation for the individual to receive guidance in their own life about the reality and the truth of why they're here and how they should act, unprompted by any filter outside of them. Though I err on that side, but I still think that society should have a religious substrate to it, and we're witnessing the problems of it, of a society that doesn't have a cohesive spiritual, religious tradition to it.
Right. Like Terrence McKenna. The reason he, this is of his own admission, one of the reasons why he took psychedelics is because he considered himself kind of spiritually retarded, to use a no-no word these days. And I guess for a person who is having these sorts of experiences, who might be, it sounds hokey, mystically talented, something like that, although it's not really of the person's doing. I see it more as a grace dispensing thing, right?
Yes. That's a good way of framing it.
It does seem like this is something I got from Paul. Paul Vanderklay, not St. Paul. When it's in one of his videos, and he talks about it's important. One of his reasons why it's important to go to church is because you're interacting with people who aren't necessarily at the top of the hierarchy, at the status hierarchy. So like you interact with, especially if you're interested in sort of that Talmudic discourse type of thing, like one of the important things about church is you're dealing with people who aren't maybe necessarily intellectually gifted. And you still have to interact with those people because those people exist in society. And as someone who can participate in that sort of theological discourse, the way I see it is you kind of have a duty to that person. And I think if the church is one body, right? So it's like you've got this rational person who's going through theological points, and they kind of have a duty to sort of clarify those points so that it is more easily understood for the people who aren't, let's say, um, involved in questions and conversations of theology. Likewise, I think there might be a similar role for someone who has dispensed sort of mystical experience through grace of participating in a organized religion wherein maybe they don't necessarily talk about it directly because it's like, how are you supposed to talk about that thing? But there is a you say something in your belief video about how you had experiences within the Christian tradition, which seemed I didn't really understand, but it seemed like they had a Christian character to them. Is that true, or is that something I'm reading into it?
Okay, I've never met Jesus, but I know that Jesus is pretty important. Right?
Yeah.
And also, after that experience of Catholicism, I really understood that Mary is very important to me. That the divine female receptacle of grace is absolutely essential to understanding how my heart functions as a receptacle for grace, and something that witnesses on the level of feeling and of care. And so I derive a lot of succor and context from, I would say, Catholicism hits my aesthetic probably best. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there are also experiences I've had of other religions which kind of help me to understand, like Buddhism. I had a very profound experience of meeting the Dalai Lama, like in a dream, but it was very, very strong. And the day before that, I had kind of dissed Buddhism as this kind of empty religion, like they're praising the void. And then I was in a dream and I was dancing with some Sufis, and then I had to go to this hut and there was the Dalai Lama, and he's like, "Oh, so you wanted to know what this is about?" I'm like, "Well, I don't know if I want to know." And he's like, "Just look in my eyes." And I fell into his eyes. I'm like, "Okay, it is the void, but it is a plenum too. It's not just an absence. There's a plenum there. It is suffused with something. It's beyond my capacity to actually understand." And that,
I think
you know, that kind of helped me to understand why there is a difference between the East and the West with regards to how we have built our traditions. There's a fundamental distinction in our conception of the source that can't be bridged by that theological level or that philosophical level. There's a reality underpinning it. It's very, very deep.
I have a kind of a little bit of a pushback against you guys in the religion sense almost. So what I see is that religion has been around for a long, long time, and throughout most of history it was very powerful. Not necessarily religion as we see it, but faith-based belief systems, belief in deities, gods, whether it's polytheism, monotheism, whether it's animism, but religion and spiritualism and belief has, in my sense of history, always been very strong in societies. And I think that even considering this sort of regressive left behavior and the rise of authoritarian right institutions, we're at a pretty good place in the scale of humanity. I was listening to John McWhorter and Glenn Lowry's podcast the other day, and John McWhorter was kind of saying how we need to convince the the normal people that the crazies are the crazies. This isn't like we're headed towards disaster. There's a small group of crazy people that we kind of need to rein in. So I don't know if I actually too much agree with that idea that bringing back religion, or that we need. I don't think there's anything wrong with people being religious, but I don't know if I necessarily see.
Wait, did you hear us be evangelical? Oh, I did say that I think we're missing that substrate.
Yeah, so
okay.
not anything. Just I don't think that you're necessarily even wrong. I just disagree with that aspect. I don't think religion is banned, but I just don't see it as a missing link, or I don't see it as being necessary at all. I think that, for a lot of people, religion is good for them. It does good things, but, and I think I've brought this up before, I kind of see you can get that same thing out of art or philosophy. I think that you're describing a lot of times when you talk about religious experience, and sometimes I think that it's easy to fall back on religion as a almost I don't know how you describe it. Maybe you could help me out, Raj, but kind of saying, these people don't have religion and they're wrong. So maybe if we put some religion back in the people, that will help guide us towards the right way. I think that we could substitute a lot of different things for religion. That might be one of the many things that helps us get back together as a good, strong community.
I see what you're saying. There are two things. I think one part of this wokeism, one of the reasons why it has so much power is because people are hungry for something spiritual or religious. Two, that's what Nietzsche thought. We can just go to art, right? That's we can dispense with the old traditions and we can go towards art and philosophy that will satiate this hunger for meaning. And I think that's true for some people. But once again, it has to do with this question of talents, right? Like, just like someone might be faster runner, better jumper, some people might be better at making meaning for themselves than other people. And for people who are bad at making meaning, I think they'll be better served if they go to church rather than the woke church. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I get that. I mean, I don't even know if we have too much of agreement. It's just I think I'm pretty much saying the same thing, to each his own. If you get meaning out of church, and going to church is what brings your community together, and even if you don't believe in God or anything you're saying, but that act of getting together and chanting or singing hymns, if somebody came up to me with a study that said, when you have churches and communities, there's a lot less violence, I'd say, maybe we should look into that. Maybe we should get people going back to church. But I think a lot of my hesitancy comes from the idea that that's sort of like the conservative evangelical religious movement. And when you talk about religion, especially popularly, people don't see the difference between, Paul Vanderklay and who's some big, like Joel Osteen. You know what I mean? Especially among younger people.
Right.
When you say the word religion or faith or Christianity or Catholicism, it kind of turns some people off right away. But I think in the sense you guys are talking about, seems to be more just about community and making meaning, not necessarily about believing in God or following a specific set of rules.
I think don't know how you sync up everybody on every level. And that was the function of a narrative, a grand narrative that has a transcendent hierarchical unitary point called God, or whatever you want to call it. Like, that was a way of organizing society where the elite could interact with the poor. Maybe, and I know it never happens like that, and I know it's always corrupted, and I know it's always, every human system's used by humans to affect humans' will, but I don't know if you're not going to have a religion. I think it's always going to be there, and people are going to just fill that. It's just a part of our code. It's a part of our machine needs that level of code running on it. And it will always default to some sort of communal code. And the one good thing about religions that have survived the test of time is that it has a place for people to interact with it purely shallowly, purely intellectually, and then use that as a pursuit to something that has a religious or spiritual content to it. And all those people can have some sort of outer congruence with each other in the way that they act and in the way that they speak about that which they're acting out.
I think this reminds me a little bit of things I've heard Camille Paglia say. Like Camille Paglia said that she has this, she noticed, I'm paraphrasing, but she noticed that her younger students were incapable of religious feeling. So I don't know if she's an atheist, but I don't think she's very religious. I think she's an atheist, actually. And she says that
she's an atheist.
Yeah, if she goes into a Catholic church, she still gets that sort of goosebump feeling. The same way when you see an amazing piece of art or hear the first chords of a symphony, and that, I think that I agree with you that sense is ingrained in people, that there's something there that religion has fed for a long time and filled, and for a lot of people will probably continue, even if it's these more sort of looser spiritual faiths that are becoming more popular. And I think you do see that fill in right away. So when people stop going to Catholic church and they hit about age 35, 40, I have several friends whose parents brought them to basically atheist church. You know, it's like Unitarian church, and they just learn about different religions, and it's just to get that community. And after a lifetime of getting away from it, something is pulling them back. And it's not belief in God very much. I don't know people who are like, oh, I woke up, I had a revelation, I believe in God, now let's all go to church. It's more like, hey, I want my kids to go somewhere every Sunday where they can see other kids, and they're from different types of stations, they're from different professions. And I think in a way those kind of churches are pretty nice because you're unifying just on wanting community more than, you know, my parents are Episcopalians, your parents are Episcopalians.
As long as they're not infected by the social justice cult, all good.
Yeah, I think that is a breeding ground though for that mentality too, though, which is kind of why I'm skeptical of religion in general. I'm not anti-religion. I'm not gonna go break down church doors or anything like that or tear down the temple, etc. But I do see that sort of faith-based thinking can quickly lead people to stop looking at evidence too closely and rely on authority, revealed truth. And I do see a connection between these more liberal churches and especially in the city. It's hard, like you can tell a certain sect of churches all have a rainbow flag or now Black Lives Matter flag outside. And it's kind of, you know, it's a little bit of a signifier that they're kind of on the social justice train a little.
All right. Seems like a pretty good place to stop.
Yeah, let's end at the impasse.
Let's do it. Sounds good.
All right.
I wanted to introduce one more thing that I want to do on the show up to the election. Just a quick, Trump or Biden, who do you think is going to win the election? Or anarchy, revolution.
I'm thinking, oh man, it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be pretty. If Trump wins, I would say move out of cities. If Biden wins, I would say stock up on rations and figure out what the fuck social justice ideology is and how to combat it from ruining every aspect of your life, because that's what's coming down the pipes.
Oh, sounds like we better call a plumber.
All right, Ben.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, guys.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you too, Ethan. Yeah.
Who's to say more than our eyes for to see within the heart of one the sun we saw before? The moon is just a goon, yet soon the curtain falls. The savior in ourselves will crumble all the walls. I know it seems a bit like we came from outer space, but Betty knows I waited, saw the alien, okay. Chalk it up to destiny, the rest of me's you. Like a pretty little rabbit chilling on the moon. I won't break the arcade game before the flash that makes the black heart taste the lash. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break day. The dead endeavor, the happiest rabbit ever within the cosmic blessing of love and energy. Drums to space, you know this is the place. Our heart and soul has saved the human race. Could it be that we truly know the score? 'Cause my alien friends say we ended the war. A bloody battle, an interstellar fight. Somehow we did it, victory of the light. But I won't break the arcade game before the flash. tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, remember break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. Can you break the arcade game before the flash? The flash that makes the dark star crash in the grass. I won't disclose the future except for what I know. Tell the radio and television to tell the show. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace sign, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. Shining in the sky, November break of day. I saw the alien, okay, okay. I saw the peace